Okay, so now that we've covered the high-level architecture, let's dive into actually installing, setting up a cluster with Jenkins X. Back to the About page. So yeah, we've covered what is Jenkins X in the intro, we've done architecture. Let's go into some of the administrator guides. Now, we mentioned that we use Terraform. So Terraform modules maintained by the open source community for AWS, Azure and Google Cloud. We have some probably they're more in progress for vanilla Kubernetes, Minikube and OpenShift. Instead, actually, let's have a look at the maturity matrix that we have. If you're not sure where to dive into or what experience to expect, then have a look at the maturity level matrix that we have here that we are maintaining. As you can see, we've got a number of features on the left-hand side, and this is the coverage that we currently have. So, as I mentioned, Google Cloud, Amazon, and Azure. And similarly, these are the ones that we will be looking over time to add better support for. Okay, for this, we're going to use a GKE, but again, we've got the same experience on Amazon and Azure. Let's go back to Administrator Guide for GKE. Okay, as mentioned, we have with V3 we focused on clearer lines of separation. So infrastructure is managed by Terraform, and once a cluster is there up and running, it is managed by GitOps via Jenkins X. So this requires two different Git repos, one for the infrastructure, one for the cluster. With V3, we've already pre-set up some of these Git repositories for you for they act as templates on GitHub, and you can easily create a new Git repository from one of these templates. So let's go ahead and do this. We're going to choose the option for Google and Terraform. So let's create this. Here we can see that we're going to create from a template Git repo here. Let's use a shared organization. You could use your own personal one, but if we're setting up Jenkins X for real, we're going to have collaboration for different developers within your teams. So it's much better to have an organization so that you can manage RBAC and have collaboration on pull requests and things. Okay, let's do this. So JX3 demo walkthrough. And we're going to call it infra because this is our infra Git repository. We can make this public, so you can go and have a look at this Git repository afterwards, but you could have this private. Okay, up here we can see we've generated this repo from the source here, and we now have a brand new Git repository in the organization I specified. So here we've got a README, and we've got the Terraform templates already set up for us to be able to create this. There are some prerequisites. Highly recommend really double checking this because the experience does change if you don't get this right. There is a bit of a UX improvement that we've always struggled with Jenkins X, and that is to create a personal access token that Jenkins X needs to be able to interact with Git. So that is under the prerequisites. Please follow these guides and generate a personal access token which is separate from your own personal account. Okay, so I've already set this up beforehand, but we may do a guide afterwards to do this properly. And now we can go down to the getting started. Now, because we're on GCP, we've got two options. We can actually use Vault for storing our secrets in, the source of truth for our secrets. But because we're on GCP, I actually kind of prefer to use more of cloud services. Google has something called Google Secrets Manager, so we want to be able to interact with this. Now, with Jenkins X, what we can do by using this template and specifying a variable to indicate using Google Secrets Manager, you'll set up all the workload identity and the access controls to be able to use Google Secrets Manager. So we have to choose whether Secrets Manager or Vault. We're going to go for Secrets Manager. And then we also need to, so here we go, choose your desired secret store and then create a brand new Git repository based on another template. So this will be for our cluster. Remember at the start we said we have a Git repo for your infrastructure, which is this one managed by Terraform. We're creating a second one for our cluster. So this will contain our applications and the installation for Jenkins X. So let's call this JX3 demo walkthrough cluster. And make this public as well. This will contain everything that we need for a Jenkins X installation. It will, once this gets installed into the cluster, this will actually be the repo that you interact with when you want to upgrade Jenkins X as well. Again, that is all done via GitOps, and we'll go through that in a separate walkthrough. Okay, so this is our cluster Git repository. Let's keep that URL. So we're going to run a couple of commands now to tell the infrastructure Git repository where our cluster one is. So once Terraform has finished creating all your cloud infrastructure, it will then instruct an installation of to provision the cluster using our GitOps repo here. So let's first of all, let's clone this Git repo. And cd work, let's make a directory walkthrough git clone. So now we have a local copy of this repo. What we've created our cluster Git repository. Now we're going to go ahead and tell Terraform about that cluster repository. Let's do this. Let's do, oops. Here we go. So we've told it. Now we're also going to have a GCP project that we're going to create this in. For now, the permissions you require is a project owner, and we want to reduce this over time, but as we're setting up a lot of IAM policies, then it does require that that you have quite elevated permissions. So to be able to do this installation, currently you need to be a project owner for this. Okay, so what we're going to do is we have a test GCP project. All right, so we've now added this. What was the next step? So because we're using Google Secrets Manager, let's ensure we are telling that, we're enabling this. Okay, so now we should be able to look at our values Terraform, and we can see, here we go, that all looks good to me. Let's go ahead and git commit, git push. Now we've done, we've pushed that configuration up to a Git repository. We'll have a different guide for setting up using Terraform and using Terraform Cloud to manage this Git repository, so that when you push changes up to this Git repository, Terraform Cloud can actually automatically apply those changes that that you are making. For this guide, we can keep it a little bit more simply. We're going to run the Terraform commands locally from our local machine, but in a real production setup, you probably want to use something like Terraform Cloud, because you don't want a state file running kept locally, because it can contain secrets and various other important information. Okay, now define two environment variables. Again, when we're using secrets, we don't want to be putting these into files, because we don't want them to accidentally get committed to Git. So from the prerequisites we mentioned, use the bot username and the bot token and set these environment variables. Now I'm going to do this off screen because I've already set them. Okay, and now I can clear. So I've set that bot username and personal access token following these. And now I'm going to do Terraform init. So this is going to start the process of creating our infrastructure. certain parts of this guide I'll probably speed up, but I'm going to do everything. I'm doing everything live here, which will obviously be recorded. But just to speed up rather than you having to wait, I'll probably speed some of the parts up. Okay, excellent. So what we can see here is the Terraform apply has finished, and that has now handed off and installed the Git operator mentioned in the architecture overview that is going to then has been deployed inside the cluster and is now talking to the cluster Git repo that we created from the template earlier, and then it's going to generate all the Kubernetes YAML into that Git repository, and then apply that inside the cluster. So we can go ahead and connect the cluster. And then we can go and have a look at the logs. Now again, this is the GitOps operator logs. So these are the administrator logs. Okay, let's talk you through this. As you can see, we have a number of resources that are being applied. Now there were a couple of steps before that. What we can do is go and have a look at our cluster Git repository and see what's actually happening. We'll just wait for this step to finish, and then we'll take you over to see. Okay, this is interesting to point out. We can see we're actually generating these secrets. So you may want to add in your own custom secrets when we chose Google Secrets Manager, but for the installation we're actually generating a number of admin passcodes. You can again customize this, but you can see we're actually just running Google G Cloud, and we're actually adding these versions in that we'll need for a setup of Jenkins X. So the source of the secret is stored outside of the cluster in Google Secrets Manager. That could be Vault, it could be a different cloud provider. But then when the cluster gets set up using GitOps, we'll be installing external secrets, which is a controller running inside the cluster and talks out to the external service and actually retrieves the real value of the secret and stores it in cluster then for our Helm charts to be able to use. Okay. Okay, whilst that carries on, let's go ahead and let's go back to the cluster Git repository, because the sync has pushed the change, so we can see we've generated a lot of the code. Now, what does that mean? We have a Helm file here that was by default, and this is the number of things that we'll actually install. Some of these things will be installed on condition, so we haven't enabled Cert Manager yet, so that won't be installed. But these are the sources, and then we can go to the individual Helm file. Helm file refers to Helm charts that we can install to different namespaces. For example, this is the Jenkins X namespace, and we can see that we've got a number of charts that's being installed. Again, that chart will only be installed if TLS is enabled, but this one, for example, Pipeline Visualizer, that will be installed as part of the installation. Same for Lighthouse, Nexus and Chart Museum, and a couple of utility controllers as well. So what actually happens is the Git operator that's running into the cluster takes the Helm file and then does a Helm file template and generates all the YAML that actually needs to be applied. Now we can see in the namespaces we can actually contain, this is all the different applications. So let's have a look. Here we go. This is the Kubernetes YAML that gets applied. Now this is very, very interesting because now we have the entire state of the cluster all in Git. It's a very much declarative approach. Therefore, any changes that need to go into your cluster should be done via Git. And you've got that full traceability. You could do rollbacks and disaster recovery, approvals as well. So this is really GitOps managing our cluster. Okay, so whilst that's going through as well, we can probably switch back. Okay, that's now finished. We are in, so we've done our apply, we connected to the cluster, we followed the logs, and now we can go and have a look at our namespace. So we're going to change into namespace. Namespace is the Kubernetes area that you can actually work on, which contains a bit more isolation. And we have a number of namespaces. So now we're connected, we can use the kubectl binary if we wanted to. Get namespaces. See, we have a number of namespaces that have been created, including Kuba Healthy. So let's go ahead and look at JX Health Status. Okay, so this is good. We've got a couple of happy statuses. We've got one error that's saying no webhooks have been received by Lighthouse. Well, we haven't created any applications yet, so not too worried about that, but that's okay. What we can also do is have a look across all namespaces. All namespaces. And we can see we've got a number of different health checks that are running, checking the health of the systems of the cluster and the installation. Everything else looks good. Okay, so that's good. And if we wanted to, we could also watch these as well. So if you have a terminal. Let's go and have a look at what's been installed. Let's go to JX UI. This is the Octant UI that we mentioned before. This is an open source project that we've added in a couple of plugins to be able to visualize and get better insight into the cluster that we've created here. So let's have a look at, we've got Jenkins X plugins down here, more the operational ones, and this is more user pipeline views and environment views. Let's go ahead and look at the health. Okay, and this is the similar kind of view that we had from the CLI. So it's using RBAC, running locally. This is Octant, running locally on my machine, connected through to the cluster using the same permissions. So if I don't have certain access to different namespaces, then it's not going to show me the results from different namespaces. That's that. Okay, so let's cancel out of that. You could just run that in the background process. Now that we've got this, one of the things we can probably show as well is the dashboard. Now this is another open source, more read-only UI that we can actually link to builds from pull requests, so we can track logs and builds and visualize the pipelines. It's running in cluster, so you're not running this outside the cluster. But again, this is all set up. We've done no builds yet, we've imported or created no projects, so that's why that's empty as well there. Okay, what we're going to do, normally we then go ahead and create a project, but that is an option. We're going to cover an optional step in this guide next. We're going to actually look at enabling TLS and DNS. So for any production grade installation, it's a typical administrative task that you want to be able to have your own domain rather than this magic nip.io one. And we also want to be able to enable TLS for secure web traffic. So that's what the next guide will do, but if you're just clicking the tiles, you can skip that guide, but we recommend looking at TLS and DNS, looking at the admin guide, and we can see TLS and DNS. Okay, we'll end that here, and the next guide will either be enable TLS and DNS or creating a project. Thank you.